Welcome back, everybody. In this lecture, we're going to be exploring a new area of social psychology when we look at the topic of relationships. Now, this idea of relationships is actually tethered into kind of a broad, overarching concept of attraction and has been tethered to that idea for an extended period of time. But there is a substantial amount of work that hasn't necessarily focused just on who we're drawn to, but how we get into these things, the benefits of relationships, and some of the different aspects to relationships that we can study as social psychologists. And this is actually where we're going to start on this lecture. What I'd like to do, just before we move on to talking about the benefits of relationships, things that kind of keep us in them, and some of the potential costs that might come out if we don't do the right things within them, is just define what relationships are, at least in terms of social psychology. So what most researchers talking about relationships argue is that anytime we have some type of connection between another individual that has some type of recurrence, some frequent recurrence, frequency being a little bit lax in terms of what we define as frequent, and is perceived as meaningful by these individuals, it's considered a relationship. But obviously, if that's our definition of a relationship, it encompasses a lot of things. Right? It could potentially involve your relationship with your instructors or your friends or some random business partner that you have, or maybe even an advisor that you meet with on a regular basis. And that's a very wide-ranging thing. And the nuances to those relationships change dramatically. And some of the reasons we're drawn into them, some of the benefits we get from them, do vary as well. So how do we study these wide ranges of relationships as social psychologists? Well, what lots of people do is they narrow down their focus as to what type of relationship they're looking at. One of the separations that's often made is the difference between what we call communal relationships and exchange relationships. Communal relationships are ones that we typically think of, I think, when we mention this idea of relationship research. Right? These are your relationships with your friends, your relationships with romantic partners, individuals where there isn't necessarily some specific goal in mind. Maybe there are at times, but these goals are oftentimes ever changing, and there's no necessarily expectation that we're going to get something in return for these relationships. And there's also no foreseeable, usually, end date to a lot of these communal relationships. Obviously, that doesn't mean that these things don't end, but when you get into them, there isn't necessarily an expectation that they're going to expire at some point after some goal's been accomplished. If that is the focus, where there is something that's trying to be accomplished, and once that's done, there's no anticipation that that relationship will continue, what we're looking at is something that we call an exchange relationship. You can think of your relationship with your instructors or your advisors, an example of exchange relationships, but you can also have ones with peers, right? If you get into a study group and you're meeting those individuals throughout the semester, maybe even having a good time with them, but the goal is to get a better grade in your class and learn more about the material. And the expectation is that once that class is done, there won't be any times where you get together again. Then this would definitely be better defined as an exchange relationship, regardless, again, of whether or not you're having a good time with these individuals that you're in the relationship with. And this kind of gets to a really interesting idea that these two things are considered dichotomous, and when we go out with friends or when we meet up with new people in specific groups, to make this decision of, is this somebody going to be a friend, or is this somebody going to be almost something like a business partner, or somebody that I'm going to utilize for something and I expect this quid pro quo, and if everything's met, then everything's great, but if it's not, well, that relationship will be severed immediately. This idea of having this dichotomy allows social scientists to study these types of relationships better. But there are a lot of people that have pushed back on this notion that we make these decisions when making new friends, or that there isn't some type of gray zone when we do form relationships, even the communal ones that we talked about earlier. One idea that's been floated to understand how relationships could strengthen or weaken regardless of its nature is this concept of something called the social exchange theory. It's this notion that when we get into relationships, regardless of whether or not they're romantic relationships, friendships, study partnerships, whatever it is, again, exchange or communal, what we do is kind of go into them looking for some type of value, and our happiness within them is determined by whether or not we think we're getting what we're expecting to get out of it. In essence, there's this expectation that you form going into a relationship saying, I'm going to put this much in and do this for the relationship, and I would expect this much in return. And that expectation does garner our kind of determination of how happy we are with that relationship and if we want to continue staying in that relationship. Again, both for communal and exchange relationships. In addition to that, if we're looking at other potential issues that could pop up, there's other possibilities in terms of relationships that we could form. We could potentially, if we're talking about romantic relationships, find another partner that maybe offers more in return and maybe requires that we provide less. There's also the potential when we talk about things like study partners, where you might find another classmate that could be a significantly better study partner, where maybe you have to do less work, or maybe they can provide more in terms of the benefits by just going into that relationship. So, when we get into relationships, regardless of what nature they are and kind of how there might be things that change and there's gray zones, these relationships are not necessarily set in stone, and they can be fluid as a result of maybe how happy we are in them. Now, it's probably important to note that most social exchange theory research has focused on romantic relationships or some of the more exchange relationships that we talked about earlier. Finding the best study partner. But there has been some recent research that suggested that we also potentially do this with things like friendships. In our current society, where people are trying to find bubbles of people to hang out with and trying to exclude maybe peripheral people more than ever before, this could potentially alter this idea and this theory. But for now, understand that even before all of this hit, there was the possibility, the potential that people could be committing the social exchange theory or utilizing the social exchange theory even with their friendships. But I also want to point out here that there is some problem with the social exchange theory as being the indicator of the only thing that determines how happy we are. This idea kind of sort of suggests that if we, say, could find a friend that would do everything for us and we'd have to do almost nothing in return, we would be over the top. We would be very excited and we would obviously pursue that friendship. Or if we were in a romantic relationship where somebody was significantly more attractive and intelligent and funny and everything, we would love to be in that romantic relationship even if we knew that we were lacking in those qualities. Well, some research has actually questioned that. And it's brought up another theory that determines whether or not we're happy in relationships, and we call it the equity theory. It's this suggestion that not only do we want to get out what we're putting into the relationship, but we do have this kind of need, both in terms of the provider and the provided, to feel some sense of equity between us and the person we're paired with. It's not, again, just the person that maybe feels like they're getting slighted that can be uncomfortable in a relationship when there is no equity. Numerous studies have shown that there's higher levels of anxiety and depression and lots of kind of relationship conflict when people feel like they're under providing for the other individual. And it might even lead them to reassess whether or not they're happy in the relationship if they're not willing to invest in it as much as the other person that they're with. And again, this can apply to not just the communal relationships, but also those exchange relationships that we talked about earlier. It's a very interesting concept, and all of these things, again, get to the fact that even though we tend to like to try to parse out relationship ideas and put relationships into specific categories, there are lots of things that are kind of overarching and that tend to make a lot of these things that we try to make disparate bleed into each other sometimes. And this leads us to a really important question, and that's, with all these relationships that we have and the types of relationships that exist, do we need all of them? Are they something that is inherently valuable to us? Now, back in the 1990s, long before we had lots of research tools to kind of gauge the statistical effects of being in relationships, there were lots of theorists, evolutionary theorists, that argued that maybe being in relationships is not just something most people like, but it's something that's kind of biologically ingrained within us. And this brings us back to that evolutionary theory that we've mentioned previously. At least I think we have. It's this notion that we might be inclined socially to be together with other individuals because there's some type of benefit that will incur if we do this, and it allows us to pass on our genes. There's this notion that our great ancestors and beyond had the ability to survive when they got together in groups and formed friendships because it was a way to get more resources and avoid more problematic things in the environment. It also, if we got together with individuals, had a much better chance of procreating and passing on our genes as well. And this idea, introduced by numerous evolutionary psychologists, but two in particular, Baumeister and Leary, led to lots of individuals in the 90s and beyond kind of trying to find a way to show the effects of being in a relationship. And there is a substantial amount of research that's actually shown that being in a relationship in general has a lot of benefits to it. Some researchers have focused their attention on the benefits of mental health statuses and kind of mental stability throughout the lifetime, and suggested that being in a relationship is one of the best ways to avoid some of the kind of mental health sways that some of us might go through in our lifetime, and help us stave off some of the cognitive decline that we start to encounter at an older age. This is also paired with numerous studies that have shown that when people are in, especially married relationships, they engage in significantly healthier behaviors than those that are not. And healthy behaviors is a wide-ranging thing, but this relates to things like healthy eating, getting exercise, avoiding dangerous activities, and essentially getting the things that are required to ensure that you can live a longer, healthier life. And this has been tied to findings that show that people who are married tend to live significantly longer than those that are unmarried. And in fact, there was a study done back in 1990 as this evolutionary theory was coming out that suggested that married men actually had a huge decrease in mortality rates each year in comparison to their unmarried peers. For example, well, not for example, but specifically, what they saw in this study was that from the married and unmarried men in their study, for each year, the unmarried men had a 250% increased risk of death each and every year that they were in this particular study. This also carried over for females, just not quite as much. They had about a 50% increased risk of death every year that they were unmarried versus married. And I know there's a lot of weight that comes with this and some weird messages that you might take out of it. Right? Some of you might think that for some weird reason I'm suggesting that you have to get married, or that that this is something that doesn't control for everything, and it's maybe a minor study that's kind of missing a lot of extra factors. We'll talk about that later, but the results are pretty profound, right? It suggests that being in a close relationship with another individual gets us to do a lot of things that could potentially allow us to live significantly longer and a much happier life overall. And it's really important to note that follow-up studies since this original one have shown that this is nothing to do with sexual orientation and men being kind of given extra advantages from women when they get married, or vice versa. Right? It's something that is kind of universally been found time and time again when we look at the link between mortality rates and who's married. And this led to actually a researcher named Harry Harlow. Actually, it's spurned off of, let's be honest, research done by another person named Harry Harlow that showed through his studies that not only do almost all primates show an innate need to be with other individuals. Most of his research focused on small monkeys called rhesus monkeys. You can see one of them pictured there on the right, and one of the main things that he used in his study, these cloth mothers that he was using as kind of a surrogate to raise these monkeys. And he showed in these studies that these monkeys preferred the cloth mother significantly more than a wire mother, even if they weren't necessarily being provided any sustenance from these cloth mothers. And if these monkeys were allowed to be exposed to other monkeys, other young monkeys, they could actually grow up to be relatively healthy, fully functional monkeys just by having these comforts and having these types of relationships, some type of comfort relationship early on in life. And his conclusion was that this, again, carried over to lots of other things, like this kind of innate need to get together with groups and us to kind of find ways to do things that are safer and healthier if we get into relationships. And obviously, as I kind of alluded to a couple times, before we jump on board with this idea, there's an important need to pump the brakes just a little bit. One of the things that people have often complained about when looking at some of this research on the benefits of, say, being married or the benefits of being in romantic relationships is whether or not we're seeing a one-directional effect. Now, the implication here is that you get in a relationship, and therefore, because you're in that relationship, you're suddenly going to be healthier. And some have asked, well, are healthier people ones that tend to be the ones that get in relationships in the first place? Are people that have a higher chance of living longer the ones that are getting married in the first place? Now, this directionality issue is a persistent problem in lots of large-scale studies when you can't control for lots of variables, and it's been considered a prominent concern when people looked at this data in this research. Another thing that's potentially a problem is whether or not, even if there is a direction here, a causal relationship. Third variables, things that haven't necessarily been explored, could potentially explain the link between these things much better. So yes, there's probably a link between mental health and being married, but maybe there's other things that are playing a role, like childhood experiences or social skills or other things that could actually be the prime cause between the link between those variables. And this could be a persistent thing in lots of different factors that we're exploring. It's not saying that there isn't some type of relationship between the two of them, but it is suggesting when we talk about these counter arguments that maybe these effects are not as absolute as we think. And there's lots of things that need to be considered before we start to jump on board this notion that everybody should get married and everybody should kind of reap the benefits of doing these things, and it's going to be a guarantee if you get into that situation. And in fact, there's some recent research that's looked at the difference between romantic relationships that have lasted a long time versus marriages that have questioned whether or not this kind of marriage thing that's been used as the box to check is really that important when we talk about all the benefits of being in relationships. And in fact, there have been some people that have even pushed back that everybody needs to be in relationships. There was a theorist a number of decades ago named John Bowlby who proposed in his work when looking at individuals that there did seem to be variations in the degree of how much people felt this need to be in relationships and why they felt the need to be in relationships. Was it anxiety driven, and was it kind of linked to this kind of need for some type of affiliation? Bowlby's work led to him talking about different types of individuals, being either secure, preoccupied, dismissive, or fearful, and it led to other researchers exploring this idea that maybe when we talk about how people get into relationships and the need for them, we do want to consider some of the individual differences in how people attach. And this actually led to the work of one of Bowlby's students that you might have heard of before, named Mary Ainsworth, who ran this very famous set of studies on attachment that involved this thing called the strange situation, where she would bring children into this room and have them either with their primary caregiver playing with another individual or on their own, or have this reuniting situation where they kind of interact with the mother. And what Ainsworth was trying to do in this study was look at how these children were attached to their primary caregivers. Typically in her study, their mothers. And then people took this and looked at how this might impact their relationships with their peers and eventually carry over to their romantic relationships. And it gave us this sense that instead of talking about everybody as being the same, driven to be in relationships and as having this inherent need, we might actually need to consider some of the individual differences that emerge. But to be even more complex on this, there is a lot of pushback now on the categorization that Bowlby and Ainsworth did when it came to the relationship approaches that people had. There was a pair of researchers named Fraley and Brennan who, a little later on, started talking about what they called the dimensions of attachment. This insistence that maybe we don't want to categorize somebody as being something like secure or preoccupied or fearful, but instead we should measure their levels of anxiety that they have with relationships, some having much higher ones than others, and their levels of avoidance when it came to relationships. And if we did that, maybe we could actually get a better sense of somebody by kind of scaling those particular levels. Note these ideas were the exact same thing as Bowlby's. It's just they didn't necessarily like the categorization thing that Bowlby led to from his original idea. And so now's probably a good time to sort of reset and reassess where we're at. And we talked about relationships existing in a lot of forms. We've talked about the fact that there is some indication that we are potentially drawn to relationships naturally. There's all these benefits from relationships, even if, and this is a big caveat that we went over in the last slide, there are some individual differences in terms of how people approach relationships, how much they feel they need to be in them, and even the data that kind of suggests the benefits of them might have some faults to them. But my guess is after everything we've covered so far, you've probably come to the conclusion, and you were probably at this conclusion before you got into this lecture, that relationships are, as a whole, a pretty darn good thing. They're valuable, and once we get into relationships, one of the things that we really want to focus on is how to maintain them, how to stay in some type of a relationship. Again, be it communal or exchange. Well, there have been a lot of theorists over the years that have explored this idea of what makes a good relationship and how to maintain them. One of the more popular ones that was looked at in the 1980s was this thing called the investment model of commitment. It was this notion that what we're doing in terms of kind of determining how happy we are in the relationship and our likelihood of staying in it is sort of using those exchange theories and equity theories we talked about before, but also factoring in kind of other situational things. So if we're going to stay in a relationship, yes, we have to be happy with it. Or I guess we have to be happy with the relationship if we're going to stay in the relationship, would be the better way to describe it. But another thing that comes up is the alternatives that could potentially present themselves. Right? If we're going to predict whether or not somebody's going to stay in a relationship, and we see an abundance of alternatives versus a lack of alternatives, there's a diminished chance with somebody with an abundance of alternatives is going to stay in that relationship. It's a fairly straightforward thing that's been not only found by Rosebolt, but it's been found by numerous researchers since then. Other things, though, that could be very big factors in the relationship is how invested somebody is in that relationship. How many things that you have kind of committed to that relationship can be a very big component to the likelihood of relationship ending. It also makes the severing of relationships all the more challenging. Numerous studies have shown that married couples that do not have kids tend to have more amicable divorces, tend to get divorced more often, and tend to not feel the lasting effects of those divorces in comparison to those with children. This can also extend to things like shared properties or shared pets even. Having some type of connection, investment within a relationship can make those relationships significantly stronger and make the severing of those significantly more challenging. In terms of how to, though, make people happier in the relationship, one of the things that we haven't mentioned that has been looked at a lot is how to be kind of good communicator within your relationship, how to handle the kind of problems that will inevitably rise when people go about their lives. One researcher back in the 1960s that introduced a really interesting idea about things that could become toxic in relationships was a gentleman named Cartman, who in 1968 talked about this really kind of unique thing called the drama triangle. It was this idea that oftentimes when conflict arises in couples, one individual within this group often feels compelled to try to pull in an outside individual, maybe a friend or a family member or somebody, to try to maybe originally just get some clarification, or potentially maybe just get somebody on their side. And when this person pulls in this third individual, they sometimes unintentionally, but sometimes maybe intentionally, create this triangle of drama where you suddenly have this individual who is now acting like they're being attacked or acting like that they're kind of the one that needs to be protected. You've got this person being pulled in who suddenly feels this need to be the protector, and you've got this other person that's being perceived as the persecutor, or the person that's kind of attacking one of the individuals. It might not have started that way, but this tends to be a common theme that pops up once that third individual is pulled in. Now, what Cartman also added to this idea is that once this gets started, this triangle continues to usually roll. So when the attacker kind of gets attacked by the person that's the protector, well, then that attacker suddenly feels like they're the one being persecuted and they're the one being attacked. So they often go to the person that they were originally attacking and kind of ask for their help, and that can sometimes lead to the person who was going to get aid to then attack the person that's supposedly protecting them. And it can cause lots of rifts within not only the original friendship, but the friendship between those individuals and the third person that was pulled in. What Cartman suggested in his work was that you need to, if you are experiencing fights, try not to do this. Try not to pull in outside members. Try to kind of figure out how to address these things. And if you are needing to pull in outside people, make sure that it's kind of in an equitable way where you don't trigger this drama triangle. Another thing that can sort of relate to this is this idea of something called negative reciprocity. This tendency for relationships as they progress to sort of engage in a tit-for-tat relationship where somebody makes a comment to the other person, and the other person, instead of taking that comment and thinking about it and processing it and maybe changing their behaviors or assessing whether or not they agree with it, just firing back some other negative comment at the other individual. And that oftentimes leads to more hostility, more frustration, less happiness within the relationship, and really over time, if this happens continually, a decay that's almost impossible to come back from. Instead, what most researchers have suggested you engage in is the opposite of negative reciprocity, called positive reciprocity, where you find ways to complement each other, even if these things are sort of unrelated to each other. So somebody might say, I really love the way you help me with blank. And the other person can say, yeah, and I really admire your strength of doing blank. And this type of communication can sometimes be forced but still effective, and other times can just be organic and sort of come out of nowhere. And in doing that, it tends to be linked to not only increased satisfaction with the relationships, but it tends to lead to much longer relationships as well. And it's something that actually many relationship coaches have pushed on people to try to get things started on the right path and sort of reverse the course of the negative reciprocity that can sometimes inherently bleed into relationships over time. Another thing that can help when we're talking about ways to kind of boost morale in relationships is to focus attention on similarities. Numerous studies have shown, and we're going to probably talk about this later, that similarity is a really important factor in who we're drawn to in the first place. There's numerous studies that show that if we find somebody that is like us or has some characteristic that's similar to us, we are much more likely to kind of value those individuals and want to pursue relationships with those people. Well, those same things that draw us to relationships in the first place have been shown to actually be able to strengthen relationships overall if there is this kind of re-exploration of the overlaps that people have within their relationships. It's sometimes something that, again, can happen organically where people point out to couples or friends how similar they are in certain characteristics, and that can be a way to strengthen relationships. But there is actually some research that's highlighted the fact that just asking people to focus on overlaps can not only increase their happiness in relationships, but also increase their perception of how much they are overlapped with another individual. And in certain times where we do have lots of conflict, either because of, I don't know, academic reasons, political reasons, social reasons, whatever, encouraging people to focus on overlaps, to try to highlight how they might not necessarily want to end a relationship or how they might be happier than they originally thought, is something that's probably a good idea to promote these days. But it's important to note here that this idea of similarity, much like everything else we talked about before, is not a guarantee for relationships to strengthen or to form, but it's one of the many things that social psychologists have found to be key players in a lot of the relationships that we find ourselves in. Um, it's also probably important to mention that there are little things that you can do to make yourself happier with your relationships. Some of this stuff is mentioned in the text. Other stuff is just things that I've come across in other studies over the years. So I figured I'd include some of these things just in case you want some things to take home with you about how to make your friendships happier and your romantic relationships happier. So one of the things that's mentioned by a researcher named Shelley Gable is to what's called capitalize on the good. That means, when good things happen, celebrate them. Celebrate your anniversaries. Celebrate the kind of accomplishments that you have. Don't, I think that the phrase is often, don't waste the good champagne. Make sure that you use it. It's a really valuable asset to think about when you start trying to find ways to strengthen your relationships. And we almost always have some type of thing that we can celebrate with other individuals. And if we embrace those things, even if they're small, there's numerous studies that show that these relationships can be strengthened, they can last much longer, and you can report much more happiness within those relationships. Another thing which is kind of interesting is that there is a lot of research that suggests that the more playful a couple is, the more happy they tend to report themselves being with the relationship. Now, I always wonder when looking at this about the directionality of these studies that Art Aron ran for numerous years. There is the potential that people are just more playful when they're happier with their relationship, and as things deteriorate, they get less and less compelled to be playful. But it is something that Aron's shown in studies that can be used to enhance relationships if people are kind of compelled to do it. The effects are not as robust as maybe some people would like, but there is definitely some research to suggest that trying to impose playfulness and maintain playfulness in relationships can again boost happiness within those relationships. And something that's kind of closely related to this is to try to find ways to, as Sandra Murray and others probably have said in your life, look on the bright side of things. Find ways to take some good out of all of the events that are happening in your life. Something that I think lots of us right now could probably use a lot of work on. Trying to find ways to twist things for the good is something that can really benefit us, as there's lots of chaos in pretty much all of our lives at this moment. And then this, of course, though, brings us back to this really interesting question of, if these things are happening and effectful, are they the things that are boosting our relationships, or are we theoretically just doing these things because our relationships are better or we're happier within them? It's a very tough thing to tease apart. It's probably not just a unidirectional thing anyway, so it wouldn't be possible to tease them apart if we wanted to. But, all of these things taken in conjunction with the stuff before hopefully can give you a better sense of how relationships work in general, and of the benefits of them. So where do we go from here? Well, what we're going to try to do, now that we've explained the notion of relationships and the benefits of them, is spend some time just simply looking at what draws us to people in the first place, how these relationships get started. So if you can, make sure you do the readings and get yourself ready for another roller coaster ride that might get a little personal when we go into this really interesting topic of attraction. Until then, take care, and hopefully I'll see many of you soon.